From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
Bucking the national trend on Election Day, it was a clean sweep for the Democratic Party in Rhode Island.
And I am going to be a governor that leads the comeback of this great state.
Every major statewide and federal office won by a Democrat. It's the first time since the 70s the state has been this blue. And when you consider a Democrat also won mayor of Providence, you have to go back to 1960 to see that kind of Democratic dominance. This week on Newsmakers, our political roundtable examines the end game to campaign 2014. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me this week on the roundtable, to my right, my colleagues from the digital side of things, WPRI.com. We have Ted Nesi and Dan McGowan. And to my left, Kara Cromwell, political strategist, and of course, Eyewitness News political analyst Joe Fleming. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me. This could be our last one for a long time, so soak it in. We had a request from Kara Cromwell to do a 6-hour Newsmakers, but that did not go over well with management. So we're going to keep it. We're going to just keep it to a half an hour today. All right. As I like to do with these, we're going to go around the table. To the right, true or false? Alan Fung would be governor-elect if Bob Healy weren't in the race.
Unclear.
I say false. I think Healy pulled from both of them.
All right.
False, I agree.
And Kara?
Oh, I'm going to make it boring. Yeah, I agree with all of you. False.
All right. Why do you say it's unclear?
Well, I think without an, I like numbers. Without an exit poll that shows specifically who those Healy voters were, how they were feeling, how they trended otherwise, I don't want to totally rule it out. I lean toward false as well because I think we didn't see any growth for Alan Fung based on the polling to what he got on Election Day, so it's not clear to me he was making a pitch that would reach a lot of other voters. But when you have a candidate who spent basically very little money, had no TV ads and everything, jump out to nearly 70,000 votes, 22%, that just scrambles the math so much that I'm not quite as confident as my friends here on definitely false.
But, particularly in the debates, ours and the others that I watched, I noticed both Raimondo and Fung completely ignored Bob Healy on that stage. Makes sense to me for Gina Raimondo to do that. Should Alan Fung have come out and attacked Healy a little bit more, Joe?
My guess is they had no polling data that showed he was moving. Our first poll had him at about 8%. The Brown poll had him about 12%. That still didn't concern them that much, numbers like that. I think it was a surprise to everyone that he jumped up to 21% of the vote.
And why did
21, excuse me.
Kara, why did he get 21%, do you think?
I think it was as much about 30 years of campaigning. He's recognizable. He's the guy everybody can say, oh, look, there's Bob Healy. And he is thought to be smart, and a lot of his ideas are very commonsensical, I'll say. And so I think he's appealing if you're kind of going with that none of the above thought.
Right, he was very much a strong protest vote, right? You could point to things you liked about him, and if you didn't like, Gina Raimondo, say on pension reform, and you didn't like Alan Fung, or you were a Ken Block supporter maybe, there were reasons to support Healy.
But there's always a protest vote. There's always that third person. Healy just...
Right. Healy's run numerous times. He gets 8-10% of the vote he usually averages. But the protest vote was simply people were not happy with either one of the two political parties this year, and they wanted to send a message. Remember in our WPRI TV polls, only like 23% of the people think the state's moving in the right direction. This is the message, I believe, of the two parties, that people are looking for change.
But it's also, you have such a strange situation when you have a Democratic nominee who had such significant problems with her, whose biggest thing in public life has been taking a benefit from public sector unions, a core Democratic constituency. That is just not something we're used to. And I think that's part of why, if you exclude Lincoln Chafee and his election, no governor has won with as few votes as Gina Raimondo got the other night since Norman Case in 1930, before FDR was elected president. This was a strange election in a lot of ways.
Well, let's talk about Gina Raimondo. It seems to me that her general election campaign was lukewarm compared to her primary effort. Do you agree with that?
No, I definitely agree, Tim. I think she ran a very well primary campaign, but the general election, it seems like right after the primary, their campaign was flat for like 3 weeks. No real paid media. Then she had the Planned Parenthood press conference, which seemed to have backfired on her. And the campaign never really got going after that. And when it did get going, it got going kind of late. And it gave Alan Fung the opportunity to really close a gap and be right there on November 4th.
Kara, talk about money, if you could here. She spent a ton of money in the primary, knowing Alan Fung was going to have matching funds, $1 million just out of the box. Could she have been a little bit tighter with the money going? It's easy to Monday morning quarterback,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
You know,
I think so.
she came out and just dominated in the primary. Could she have saved more of that money?
I mean, there's two schools of thought, and you hate to be that person who wakes up the day after the primary with $1 million in the bank and having had lost. But I think they knew she was up by a fair margin, and maybe they could have set a little bit aside for the general. But I think more importantly, they needed to balance a little bit of her maybe public appearances with her fundraising time. It seemed like she was focused on raising money as opposed to being out and about. And again, she won.
I was just going to say,
So,
the flip side is she won the election.
Right.
And, you know, in the
So
end,
the
you
decisions were-
get, as Lincoln Chafee proved, you get to be the governor no matter how few votes gets you there. And I think the challenge now for Gina Raimondo, like Lincoln Chafee hadn't failed at, is to build her support off a base of 40%. Not to, and I don't think she's going to be satisfied with being the 40% governor.
No.
But she has a big advantage. Lincoln Chafee did not. She has a political party. She can build from that base. Democrats are very strong on Rhode Island. I mean, she lost Johnson and North Providence, two Democratic areas. She could rebuild support in those two towns very easily. So I think you're going to see her numbers move up fairly quickly.
And she did so well. You know, one thing is, too, with Alan Fung, I was very surprised by how relatively poorly he did in some places. Cranston turnout, he's the mayor of Cranston. The Cranston turnout was the lowest in the past 4 races for governor. I mean, you'd expect it to go up with the mayor on the ballot. He did win, but he actually won fewer votes there than Kachiri did as well. So you had that. Gina Raimondo won East Greenwich, a fairly Republican
So
town.
what are we talking about here? Ground game? Once again, Republicans
I think
struggle.
ground game is a big part of it, but I also think Gina Raimondo didn't lose her appeal to at least some independent, suburban types, higher income or highly educated folks, but she kept, and this is why I never agreed with folks who said she should run as an independent, because she would have lost
remember we
all
talked
those
about that.
urban core Democratic votes, or most of them, if she wasn't the D.
And more importantly, she would not have benefited from DGA money or Emily's List money.
All right, Alan Fung, do you, in our debate, I think it was, he said that he supported right to work. That was, and I should point out, that was a primary debate, so he was still trying to get through the primary and beat Ken Block, which he did. Was that a mistake? Could he have, in any way, gotten the union support because Gina Raimondo had trouble there?
He may not have got public union support, but he could have neutralized the unions. As soon as he said right to work, he really alienated himself with the unions. Matter of fact, I got a couple things here. The unions actually did some mailers, and here's one from the AFL-CIO. Alan Funk is bad for working families in Rhode Island. They're not saying vote for Gina or vote for Bob Healy.
Okay, so
they're just
that goes
criticizing
back to
him.
my question then. Would that mailer, those mailers
I'm
have
saying
gone
it may
out?
not have happened if
Right.
he did not say he was for right to work.
Right, it gave them a reason
Exactly.
not to support him. And I think the other issue, right, Alan Fung had this experience of running a pretty weak primary against Ken Block, and then came back and with $1 million in state and matching funds. He ran a pretty strong campaign against Gina, but at the end, again, having union support and maybe being a little bit too much of the right to work stuff. Probably
Now, I'll give Alan Fung credit to the extent that if he actually believes Rhode Island to be a right to work state, he took a stand that he believes in, and it potentially hurt him in the general election.
We can't get into his head. Hold on, we can't get into his head. We don't know if he actually believes that or not. He might have said it to get through the primary.
That's what I was going to say.
Did
Definitely.
he need to say that to get through
Well,
the primary?
again, the problem is in a Republican primary, you don't know who's coming out to vote. And it's a very small primary, so you got to move to the right. And that's what he was doing,
Yeah, but he
moving to the
focused
right.
everything on Cranston, didn't he? I mean,
Well, that was his main strategy was when Cranston and Water.
So how does the right to work?
Well,
that
trying to
statement
pick up
change
some
that?
people in other parts of the state. If he said he wasn't right to work, Ken Block could have run with that and try to get more conservative votes in the state of Rhode Island.
Yeah.
So-
Well, and remember, he made that comment one time. It's not like he campaigned on a right to work campaign
Right,
by
right.
any means. He made it one time
Just
in
say
a
it
debate
once.
question, and it was used forever.
But for
and
the
ever against
unions,
him.
you only have to say that
Absolutely.
once.
Of course.
And I'm not clear that the unions ended up going home to the governor-elect. I'm guessing that some of them are part of that Healy block of 21%.
There's no retirees, public sector employees or retirees. Definitely, I really believe, went with Bob Healy. They felt they could not vote for Gina. And again, they did not want to vote Republican because a lot of them are Democrats. So Bob Healy was their alternative, no question.
So I don't know if that hurt Alan in the end, because I don't think they were going to go to him. I don't think they ended up with her anyway.
Big night for Democrats. I think I used the phrase clean sweep, which was being chanted at the Biltmore all night long. But it was not necessarily a good night for the endorsed candidates, or this whole election wasn't very good for the endorsed candidates, right, John?
No, absolutely. Tim, look at the candidates that ran statewide. Gina was not endorsed in the primary. No Democrat for governor was. Dan McKee was not the endorsed candidate. Nellie wasn't the endorsed candidate. Seth wasn't the endorsed candidate. The only one who was Peter Kilmartin, who had no primary.
Yeah.
So the Democratic Party endorsement does not mean what it used to in the state of Rhode Island.
Or is it the kiss of death?
Well, again, there's other things that happen to the primary.
Well, and by
that
the way,
affect
how do you get the Democratic Party endorsement? By being the choice of the House Speaker, Nicholas Mattiello. So none of the people who won were Nick Mattiello's choices to be in those offices. I mean, Gina aside because there was no endorsement. But the other three down ballot races, I mean, I'll be very interested to see how Nellie Gorbea handles the General Assembly. Jim Langevin proved you can get a lot of publicity and make some impact if you beat up on the General Assembly from that office. She has very little reason to protect the General Assembly. They didn't do much. The leadership of the General Assembly didn't do much to get her elected.
Right, and she campaigned on get rid of voter ID, and so is the legislature going to have the appetite to do that? And Speaker Mattiello supported that.
I think it depends on what she wants to do next. If she's looking to run statewide, it's one thing. If she's looking at a federal office, she probably can beat up on them.
Of course, I don't know if we'll have a federal office open around until like 2050 at this rate.
I want to pivot, Dan, to the Providence mayoral race. You had a great piece that published Friday morning on WPRI.com on how Jorge Elorza won. Sum it up if you can. How did he march to victory in this?
Sure. So obviously he carried the East Side overwhelmingly, far more than even most of us thought he was going to do. I thought he'd probably win by 4,000 votes on the East Side. He won by about 5,500 votes on the East Side. That's a lot of votes in a small, 38,000 person election. But there are other key factors here. One, he pulled in. Remember he ran a contentious primary against Michael Solomon. Michael Solomon endorsed him the day after the primary, was with him nonstop. Michael Solomon was very popular on the South Side, where Buddy Cianci won the South Side, just like Mike Solomon did in the primary, but Jorge Elorza was able to pick off votes, right? He was able to do that on the South Side, and then in the North End, on the other side, one of the sort of unspoken heroes in this race to the Elorza folks is Nick Narducci, the councilman from the 4th Ward. In fact, I know on Election Day, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse had lunch with him. He was so proud of the work that Nick Narducci did in the 4th Ward.
And I think another point Dan made in a story last week on PRI.com, and God bless you, Dan, for the number of stories you've published the last couple of weeks. But
you got nothing else to do.
I don't know, you're getting laid off, unfortunately, but the extraordinary campaign against Buddy Cianci that went all the way to President Obama. I mean, the work behind the scenes by particularly Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, getting the U.S. attorneys together. I'm sure he and Jack Reed had a role in getting Obama to endorse Jorge Elorza and meet with him briefly. The money that poured into Jorge Elorza's campaign. I mean, while the Elorza people don't like when things are taken away from him as a candidate, it's as much about him being the vehicle for those who did not want the return of Buddy Cianci as Jorge Elorza's own efforts.
Do you think he broke the ceiling on Election Day that some might have thought he had? What did he get, 44?
45%.
Cianci, I'm sorry, Buddy Cianci.
Yeah, I think Buddy Cianci did break the ceiling. I mean, in any of the public polls, there were two, and he was 38%.
So with that in mind, Joe, I'll ask you this. If Buddy Cianci on June 25th knew that this was going to be essentially a two-candidate race, would he have jumped in?
There's no doubt in my mind, if Buddy Cianci saw what was coming, the two candidates, he would not be running for mayor at all. I think he would have just taken a pass on it. I think from June 25th on, it was all downhill for Buddy because nothing was breaking right. First, he had to run as an independent. I think he wanted to run as a Democrat. Then Lon Adrian drops out of the race. Then Brett Smiley drops out and gives Elorza the primary over Michael Solomon. Then after the primary, everything came together for Elorza. I mean, U.S. attorneys are having press conferences saying, not Buddy Cianci. I mean, the President of the United States is supporting a mayor. So nothing was going right for Buddy.
And very briefly, because I know we're up against a break, but there were times it didn't look like the anti-CNC forces were doing a particularly good job. The mess with Lauren Adrian's outside spending group and everything, but clearly in the end, messy as a campaign sometimes is going through it, they did what they had to do to get Jorge Elorza across the finish line convincingly.
And even Harrop maxed out to his opponent.
And maxed out and then voted for him.
I've never, ever heard that happen before.
What did Dr. Harrop get in the end?
He ended up with about 3% of the vote, a little bit under 3% of the vote.
All right, it was essentially a two-candidate race. We're going to continue, actually, the Providence conversation when we come back, and we're going to take a look at what was a pretty good night for Republicans nationally. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. This week we're doing a political roundtable, a post-mortem, if you will, on Election Day. I am joined by WPRI.com reporters Ted Nesi and Dan McGowan, and also Kara Cromwell and Joe Fleming. All right, I want to wrap up the Providence conversation. Give us a little insight here. Jorge Elorza, mayor-elect, takes the office in January. The folks that helped him get into office, do you expect to see some appointments there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, Brett Smiley, who dropped out of the primary and endorsed him over Mike Solomon, the guy deserves whatever he wants, right? I mean, he essentially delivered the primary to Michael Solomon.
Chief of staff, maybe?
He could be chief of staff, could be director of administration. I would imagine he gets whatever he wants. His campaign manager, Marissa O'Gara, she's been with him since January. Nobody thought he was going to win in January. I assume that she'll be on board. You got to assume David Ortiz, the spokesperson who was with Mayor Taveras for the last couple of years, you got to assume he comes on board too.
Big winner to Mayor Taveras that night.
Absolutely.
I mean, he did not want his legacy to be a failed bid for governor and a comeback for Buddy Cianci, and he did work hard behind the scenes and sometimes publicly for Jorge Elorza and got what he wanted.
All right, let's talk about the national outlook politically. Good news for Senator Jack Reed is he not only won, but Ted, I think he had the second highest margin of victory in the country.
For any U.S. senator and the highest for a Democrat.
All right. The bad news is he's not going back to a very friendly environment.
No, I mean, you have the Democrats losing their majority and losing hard. I mean, it looks like the Republicans, I think, will be at 54, 55 seats. Many commentators had thought they'd only be at maybe a 50 tie or 51 or 52. And first of all, that, of course, means Jack Reed won't be the chairman of this powerful Senate Armed Services Committee come January, which he was in line to get. But it also means when the Republicans are up by that many seats, while the map is friendly to Democrats in 2016 for where the U.S. Senate seats are up, they need to win a bunch of seats to get back. They're not close now. And so it looked like before this election, maybe Reed, there'd be a seesaw and quickly it'd be back to Democratic control. Reed would get that gavel. It doesn't look like for now that it's any guarantee. And so Jack Reed's going to hold off on something would have been a big prize for him. And then, of course, Sheldon Whitehouse isn't anywhere near a chairmanship and is, of course, he's never been in the minority, don't forget. Sheldon Whitehouse won in that Democratic wave of 06. So this is going to be a very new and different experience for Sheldon Whitehouse being in the minority party.
Kara, I would imagine it's going to be harder for Whitehouse than Jack Reed.
Probably. I mean, I think Senator Reed is really well respected on both sides of the aisle, works well with others. He's as popular in the Senate as he is in Rhode Island. And I think Senator Whitehouse gets along very well with members of the other party as well, but just doesn't have the seniority at this point that Senator Reed does.
And that's something people at home might be surprised by because they know Sheldon Whitehouse as a sort of
Progressive,
liberal warrior.
yeah.
Right.
But I
he has good
agree
friends
with Kara.
on both sides of
He
the
does.
aisle.
He gets on well with John McCain, actually, who might be Armed Services Chairman, and there's others who speak well of Sheldon Whitehouse despite his sort of political profile as such a crusading liberal.
Why did the GOP wave stop at New England, at the borders of New England, do you think?
I don't know that it did. Charlie Baker in Massachusetts was elected. It was close, but he was elected, was the only new Republican office holder, federal or state, in New England. And I think things shifted to the right a little bit. I think, as we discussed before, we have an ed reformer as the lieutenant governor in Rhode Island and a pension reformer as the new governor. Rhode Island picked up, we have 5 new state reps that are Republicans, and in Massachusetts there were 6 pickups there. So even if it looks like the red wave stopped, there's a little bit of pinkness that I think may have slid in, and maybe it's a little more purple than it was on Monday.
You agree with that, Joe?
Well, I think on the statewide level, no. I mean, the first time, as you said, since like 1990, the Democrats have all the statewide seats. So the Republicans are still a very small minority in the state of Rhode Island. They do have the mayorships of Cranston and Warwick, though, which do give you springboards. I mean, Scott Navadesian, people for years said, what is he going to do? So obviously there may be some pressure on Scott to do something statewide down the road.
Scott Navadesian bulletproof. I mean, 75% in his reelection. He beat off that Republican primary challenge relatively easily in the summer.
And I think the Burrville Town Council went all Republican, didn't it? Did
I
hear
believe
that?
there was a swing in
That
Burrville.
is the kind
I'll
of
throw that out
granular
there.
analysis that we like on
But
Newsmakers.
the flip side is, I mean,
Hey,
this was a
I'm throwing it out
year.
there.
This was a year for Republicans potentially to make some gains. I mean, I was somewhat surprised that Dawson Hodgson and Ernie Almonte, for example, running for AG and treasurer, didn't at least get it closer. I thought the Democrats were the favorite as Democrats, but they still were down by double digits, which is where they were in Joe's poll.
Right, but the problem, though, Ted, is simply Buddy Cianci. Again, sucking the oxygen out of all the races. I mean, Channel 12 probably would have had an attorney general's debate, but because of the problems mayors, well, I mean, a live debate on prime time. Sorry, Tim.
We had 12 debates, Joe Fleming, okay?
I know, Tim. But you know what I mean,
Yes.
by the PPAC type debate.
Yeah.
But because of the Providence mayor's race, it wasn't such a high profile race.
I want to just quickly touch on Massachusetts. You worked for the Charlie Baker campaign, but it seemed to me more of a nail biter than I thought it was going to be. Charlie Baker coming out on top. What was your, from the front row seats, what was your...
I think both campaigns knew it was always going to be close, and it was a question of getting out there and talking about vision and getting voters really excited.
Did Martha Coakley lose it or Charlie Baker win it?
I'll say Charlie won.
Okay.
I mean, for sure.
I think a strategist won it. I think Charlie Baker, you see too the difference. You see Charlie Baker won there in really a two-way race. So there were a bunch of independents. Alan Fung lost to Gina Raimondo down here, but Charlie Baker invested so much time and energy over a long period of time and was very well funded in a ground game and in actually holding down Democratic margins in urban areas. Charlie Baker worked much harder by all accounts this year than in 2010 in making sure Martha Coakley only won by 35 points or something in Boston versus like 47 last time. And that matters. There's no electoral college in these states. If you hold them down in urban areas.
And that didn't happen in Rhode Island. Not
Exactly.
at all. I mean, Gina won Providence, Pawtucket, Central Falls, Woonsocket by 20,000 votes, where Alan Fung won Cranston and Warwick by a total of 8,000 votes. You can't do that. You need to make some inroads. And in Providence alone, 15,000 votes. And that happens all the time. Providence is a key for the Democrats.
Cianci's impact on Providence here. A lot of people thought turnout in Providence would be enormous because he was in the race and that, as he said, took all the oxygen out of the room. Did he help the Democrats here? Was the turnout just gangbusters?
No, I don't think it was all that much larger. It was larger than I thought it would be. But, remember, for Buddy Cianci, it probably splits both ways. There were probably plenty of Republicans who voted for Buddy Cianci and also voted for Alan Fung. But then, of course, for the Democrats, there were plenty of people who supported. I saw signs: Gina Raimondo, David Cicilline, Buddy Cianci for mayor on people's lawns in Providence.
I think it was a good lesson, the Baker campaign, in going after every vote, not conceding gateway cities in Massachusetts, places that are traditional Democratic strongholds, or places like Dorchester.
Is that easier?
Where Charlie spent a lot of time campaigning and discussing an urban agenda.
Working with African American ministers.
And making Massachusetts great for everyone.
Do you think that's easier to do in a midterm election than a presidential election in any way?
I don't know. It'll be interesting to see, certainly. I don't know.
Dan, I'm wondering if you could briefly give us a breakdown on what's happening in Providence's 3rd Ward to put you on the spot. I mean, it's pretty tight.
Yeah, it sounds like now Councilman Kevin Jackson, who has been in the council since 1995, is the longest-serving councilman. He had this write-in campaign against him by a guy named Marcus Mitchell, who only got into the race a month ago and nearly knocked him off. But it sounds like Kevin Jackson's going to hold on to the seat. He's up, I think, 150 votes, so he's going to hold on to the seat. But it's a remarkable write-in campaign. I mean, to go from not being known by anybody a month ago to winning, 1,800 votes, that is unprecedented.
And of course, what drove it? Jackson was a predominant Buddy Cianci supporter who also has $30,000 in Board of Election fines, a bit damaged, and he has a redistricted ward.
So, Ted, is this one of those situations of Mr. Alorza, I have bad news for you. You've won the election. I mean,
I think not only the city election, but even the statewide ones. I mean, in a lot of ways, sometimes it felt like a bit of a fantasy land, despite the best efforts of the debate questioners. That both the city and the state are in a real muddle in terms of the finances of both. There isn't a lot of money coming in. There are big shortfalls projected in both the city and the state level, and just no signs of really strong breakout economic growth in the state that would sort of lift all boats and help them out. And I think for these people, the Democrats want everything. Well, their supporters are going to be looking for them to make a lot of changes and give out benefits. Well, the flip side is Gina Raimondo needs to cut at the moment about $170 million out of the next state budget to get that to balance. And Jorge Alorza, Dan had a story, could be looking at upwards of $24 million deficit in the city.
And remember, in Providence, you don't have Speaker Gordon Fox anymore. So now you've got Nicholas Mattiello, who I'm sure he's going to put a focus on Providence, but it's not going to be quite like Gordon Fox.
All right, we got 2 minutes left. I want to do a Campaign 2014 Newsmakers Award. Now, from start to finish, briefly, for anyone who wants to weigh in, who ran the best campaign, start to finish, including the primary, including the general election?
I'll surprise you. Maybe Nellie Gorbea. I was going to say Dan McKee, a guy who didn't get endorsed in the primary, had a lot of opposition from his own party in the general election, and came out and won by 20 points.
I say Nellie Gorbea because, especially in that primary,
yeah.
at least Dan McKee had outside money coming from. Nellie Gorbea won that on the ground and with very smart strategy and just going hard after opponent.
Who had the best campaign ad, Kara?
I liked the Narragansett beer ad.
I agree. That was a nice
I got to give that award
Governor-elect.
to Brett Smiley.
Yeah.
That primary ad he had, I thought was very funny.
Didn't quite work.
self-deprecating. Didn't quite work.
It needed to work. I don't think it was. I don't think it was as effective. It was funny. I think the Narragansett
Who
Beer
had the
ad was
worst
effective.
campaign ad?
Ooh.
There were some stinkers.
I don't think we're going to say it, yeah.
All right, any game-changing moments throughout the campaign, Ted, that you covered? Do you think there was a pivotal moment?
You know, I do think I
Less than
was
a
a
minute.
little skeptical at first, but I think that Planned Parenthood rally and the fallout from it with Gina Raimondo, there'll be a long debate over how much it hurt her, how much. And all I know is it seemed like it was, to many people watching from home, it seemed like that was her only big statement in the general election for a long time was about partial birth abortion. That might be partly how it was covered, but that's the perception.
It's interesting you said that.
10 seconds.
Oh, sorry. Who? It was a game changer, but I think it was the lack of Fung stepping in and taking advantage of the opportunity that made.
What
it
are we
the
going to
game
do
changer.
now? The elections are over. Ted Nisi, Dan McGowan, Joe Fleming, Kara Cromwell, thank you very much. And a special thanks to Nick Dommings, the guy in my ear during the debates. Great job this season. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.